All right, Charger fans. I don't know about you, but this feels like a must win game on Sunday as the Chargers head to Miami to take on the Dolphins. It is a matchup of the 2020 draft, Herbert versus Tua. As we all know, the Dolphins selected Tua, the Chargers selected Herbert, and the rest has been history. A lot of back and forth debates since the 2020 draft as who's the better quarterback, but it's looking pretty apparent that the Chargers got the better end of the deal. But the Dolphins are 1-4 this season. They have not played very well. Their defense is ranked dead last according to PFF in the NFL. The Chargers are on a 2-game losing streak, trying to swing their momentum back into their favor, stay 4-0 in the AFC. I think this is a must-win game for the Chargers this week. The Broncos are getting hot. They beat the Eagles last week. The Chiefs lost on Monday, but the Chiefs will get on a streak at some point, and it will be a very competitive AFC West as the season progresses. So I think it's must win for the Chargers this week to get back on track and find a win down in South Florida. Also in this episode, we'll talk about some of the moves the Chargers made this week with the acquisition of Odafe Oweh from the Ravens. The Chargers sent Alohi Gilman to the Ravens in return, along with an exchange of picks. I think that's also a great addition to the Chargers. They've been having some issues with the pass rush, especially since Khalil Mack has been out. So we'll talk about that trade as well. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Electric Edge Podcast on YouTube. You can also listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Follow me on social media. I am at Electric Edge Pod on TikTok, Instagram, and X. I'm almost at 500 followers on TikTok, so hopefully we can make that push to get to 500 by the end of this week. All right, so with that being said, let's jump into some Chargers news and talk about the matchup heading down into South Florida. Okay, let's start this episode with the trade that took place on Tuesday. So the Chargers traded Alohi Gilman and a 2026 fifth-round pick to the Ravens in exchange for Odafe Oweh and a 2027 seventh-round pick. Now, Oweh last year had a career high of 10 sacks, and there's a stat that I saw that Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack combined last year had 10 sacks. However, this year he has not recorded a sack, and I think that's also partly because of how the Ravens have underperformed. But I think this is a great trade for the Chargers. Last week we saw against Washington, they could not get their pass rush going. Jaden Daniels did whatever he wanted to do on the field. They also couldn't stop anything in the run. I think this is a great trade for the Chargers. I think it helps this defensive line. And not to mention, Khalil Mack may be coming back very shortly. I think next week his window to return opens. So this defensive line can become very dangerous very quickly with the addition of Oweh, plus Khalil Mack coming back, plus Thule is starting to play at a high level. Hopefully this is a sign for good things to come. And I just want to go through real quick Oweh's PFF grades that I had found from this year, and then also talk about his grades last year. Okay, right now, so Oweh has a 70.3 overall grade. He's ranked 51st out of 169 edge rushers. He does very well in the pass rush. And like I mentioned last week, Jaden Daniels just seemed to be able to do whatever he wanted to do in the pocket once that critical turnover happened with QJ. But let's take a look at last year's stats too. So let's pull up his grade last year. He's ranked 45th last year. Pass rush is always good. His run defensive grade was also a little better than this year. And then his stats from last year, he had 10 sacks. So like I mentioned, that's going to be a big help on this defensive line. I know Jim Harbaugh in his press conference was excited to have him. Greg Roman talked highly about him as well. He talked about in his press conference today about I don't think it was a strip sack, but he got pressure, punched a ball out against the Chiefs, and Greg Roman said something along the lines of he became a favorite in our household. So I think this is a great move for the Chargers. Alohi Gilman, he's been a great Charger. He wasn't playing up to par, at least in my opinion, this year. There was a couple plays, especially I remember the play ending the first half against Denver, which was blown coverage, and Sutton was down the field and caught that long touchdown pass. but it helps the Ravens because they need some help in their secondary. So I think this is a win-win trade for both teams, but I do think the Chargers got the better end of the deal acquiring Oweh. So he's expected to play as well Sunday against Miami. So that will be a big help on this defensive line that has struggled the past 2 weeks. All right, let's talk about some other transactions that the Chargers have made this week. They signed center Josh Kaltenberger and Jalen Rager to the practice squad. They released Michael Dunn and linebacker Kanai Maga from the practice squad. Jalen Rager's probably signed because Darius Davis is having some knee issues. Don't know when he's going to be back. He's still on the injury report. And just talking about the injury report, since we're on the topic, don't have the injury report for Thursday, which is today. But as of Wednesday, we have quite a few individuals on it. Keenan Allen had his normal rest. Joe Alt was still out. However, there's been reports that Joe Alt is without his walking boot around the Chargers facility. So my guess is that he will play next week against the Colts. Don't think he's going to be able to suit up this week. He's still not practicing, but I think he is going to be able to play next week. Only makes sense because they didn't put him on an IR. I think just his injury isn't as severe as some may have thought. So I think he suits up next week for the Colts. We got Mekhi Becton, who was limited. He's wearing his non-contact jersey at practice yesterday. He also has his hand in a club. So that's something to keep an eye out on. Darius Davis, once again, didn't practice. Bud Dupree, hamstring, didn't practice. Deshaun Hand, who was out last week, didn't practice as well. Quentin Johnson made his debut on the injury report with a hamstring. Trey Pipkins, who was in and out of the game last week against Washington, is on here with a knee. Denzel Perryman, I know his 21-day window opened up, so he may come back. I don't know if it's this week, but probably next week against the Colts. Jarmary Salyer's on here. He was limited, and Jasir Taylor was sick, and he did not practice. I'm sure this injury report will update as practice finishes today, so it's something to keep an eye out on. But I think Mekhi Becton will play. We'll see what the deal is with Trey Pipkins and Salyer, since Salyer seems to be able to swing from guard to tackle on this line. So something to keep an eye out for heading into Miami. We all know the deal last week with the issues with the offensive line and the amount of sacks being given up. So definitely something to keep an eye out on as this week finishes up and they head to South Florida. All right, so let's talk into the actual matchup against Miami. So like I said, Miami is 1-4 on the year. There were some games that they had the lead and they've blown, whether it's pick, whether it's their defense falling apart. I mean, last week against Carolina, they had a pretty big lead. I think it was a 2-score lead, and Rico Dowell ran all over them, and they wound up losing that game. All right, so they're graded according to PFF. They're ranked 31st overall in the NFL. Offense is ranked 25th. Defense is ranked dead last. And special teams is ranked 27th. Right now, the Chargers have a 4.5 point favorite right now going down to South Florida. The Chargers, I think, have been favorited in every game except against the Chiefs. But the way this offensive line played last week, I'm very skeptical about what the Chargers do. You know, I wish I had more confidence, but we haven't gotten Alt back yet. There's some other offensive linemen that are on the injury report. I don't know what is going to be the case come Sunday. Also, I don't know what the starting five has been at practice as well. Waiting for some reports to come out on X from either Chris Ream or Daniel Popper to talk about who is the starting five on the offensive line in practice today. So that's going to be something to keep an eye out on, as always, with this team, because for some reason, our offensive line can just never stay healthy. Let's talk about some of the players and things to watch going down to Miami. So he was thrown for 1,000 yards this year. Their big weapon right now is Devin Achane and also Darren Waller, who's made a resurgence the past 2 weeks. Tyreek Hill for them is out for the year, but Jalen Waddle has stepped up into that wide receiver one role. It's going to be interesting to watch how our defense rebounds from last week, being able to stop the run. Devin Achane will run all over you. I'm curious to see what they're doing in practice to game plan for him. Also, Waddle and Darren Waller. The other piece of this is that Tua landed on Miami's injury report, so there is a chance that Zach Wilson starts for the Dolphins. I know Tua is limited, I think, with a thumb injury and also a hip injury. So Zach Wilson would start if Tua can't go on Sunday. So as far as total offense for the Dolphins, they average about 278 yards a game. and the Chargers defense is giving about 293 yards a game. But the Dolphins defense is averaging about 386 yards a game. So, I mean, if the offensive line can hold up for the Chargers, this should be a game that Herbert throws, I'm going to say 30 to 35 times. We also got word about the Chargers offense that Kimani Vidal and Hassan Haskins will split carries. I thought last week against Washington, Vidal ran a lot harder than Haskins did, but we'll see what that split looks like. I would put a slight edge on Vidal, but like I said, Greg Roman came out today and talked about that they'll split carries between the two. But the Dolphins' run defense right now is giving up about 174 yards a game, and passing, they're giving up about 212. And the Chargers, after last week's game, as far as passing, they're giving up 172 yards a game, and rushing, they give up 121 yards a game. Like I said, Devin A-Chain will run all over you. So it's something that hopefully they are fixing from last week where Krosky Merritt just ran all over them, along with Jaden Daniels when he needed to use his legs, was successful on converting. Now, offensively, the Chargers dropped significantly from last week. The Chargers offensively, they're ranked 12th right now in the NFL. They're still averaging about 352 yards a game, passing 235 yards, and then rushing 116. That rushing, I think, is going to drop quite a bit with Hampton going down. Hampton was put on the IR this week, so he'll be out a minimum of 4 games. But it's going to be one of those games where it depends on what the offensive line can do, how much time they can give Herbert. I think last week, once again, he only had 2.5 seconds to throw the ball, which you can't get anything developed down the field with that amount of time. And it also, with this offensive line, what does the run game look like? You don't have your number one back. How well can the Chargers run the ball on Sunday? There's a lot of question marks around this team with all the injuries they've had. I mean, it's almost like a CVS receipt with how many injuries the Chargers have had so far into the year. But it's not an excuse. You know, there's 31 other teams in the NFL, and every single one of them has injuries. And some teams find a way to overcome adversity, and some don't. And right now, the Chargers are not finding a way to overcome adversity. The other point is that they need to get the penalty issue under control. And Greg Roman had talked about that in his press conference today. 2 weeks in a row, uncharacteristic amount of penalties. I think Herbert mentioned in his press conference yesterday that if you commit a penalty in practice, you go work out with Coach Herbert afterwards as a punishment. But, you know, Chargers need to find a way to limit these penalties. It's killed them in 2 weeks in a row. It's both resulted in losses. You can't have 100 penalty yards in each game and expect to win the NFL. It's just not going to happen. But back to the injury piece. You know, like I mentioned in my last episode, take, for example, the Cowboys, take, for example, the Bucks. They have injuries on their offensive line. The Bucks have Bucky Irving out, and they find ways to win. You know, the Chargers need to figure it out, find ways to win. And to caveat that, Greg Roman had mentioned today that everyone on this roster is here for a reason, and they need to contribute and do their job and do what they're supposed to do in order to win. And some players, we've talked about Deckless, we've talked about Bozeman, we've talked about Pipkins. You know, they got to hold up their end of the deal. So we'll see if this gets cleaned up and rectified before Sunday. But I am just extremely cautious as to what this team is going to be heading into Sunday into Miami. The Chargers offensive line right now has allowed 86 pressures this season, and the Dolphins ranked 18th in pressures. You know, going into that Giants game, I think the Giants were ranked almost dead last in pass defense and how many pressures they get on Herbert and how many sacks they get on Herbert. So, you know, these numbers are great and all, but the reality is there has been some glaring holes in this offensive line. And how do you respond and fix it going into a very winnable game in South Florida? And it's not like Miami has scrubs either on their defense. They have Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, Rasul Douglas, who's playing very well. Minka Fitzpatrick, who's also playing very well. Jordan Brooks, who's a linebacker, is playing well. And their draft pick, I think, from last year, Chop Robinson, too, is not having a great year. But it doesn't matter because if you can't block, your offense isn't going to do anything. And Greg Roman made a good point saying in this press conference. He said, the offense was clicking on Sunday against Washington up until the middle of the second quarter. Like, they're moving the ball up and down the field. They should have went up 17-0 at one point. And then it all fell apart. And it's, well, how do you overcome that adversity? What happens if the same thing happens in Miami? You're just going to stop playing, give up 27 unanswered points like they did against Washington? How do you respond when things aren't going your way? When you're committing penalties, where your quarterback's taking too many pressures and sacks? This team has to find a way on Sunday to win. I think this is a must-win game for the Chargers because right now they're still in first. They still have that division record that's keeping them afloat. But you went down to Miami, you have an AFC conference record of 4-0, which definitely helps you with playoff implications down the road. But like I said, even though this Miami team is 1-4, they have good pieces. You got to get pressure on Tua. Tua's known for, if his first read isn't there, he starts to panic. Put pressure on him. Tua is bound to make mistakes. We've seen it time and time again with him. I think in the Colts game, which was game 1 for them, he had 3 turnovers. He had that bad pick against the Bills. Let's see what he did last week against Carolina. So Tua last week against Carolina, he was 27-36 for 256 yards, 3 touchdowns, and he took 3 sacks. So he didn't have a turnover. But this defense also has had an issue with turnovers. Last week they had a forced fumble, which they recovered. But prior to that, they only had 3 picks against the Raiders. So can you put enough pressure on Tua this week to force him to make bad decisions and turn the ball over? That would be critical. But, the keys to this game goes back to the same things I talk about, right? You got to protect Herbert. You got to limit the penalties. You got to execute in the red zone. And Greg Roman also talked about this today in his press conference. Not executing enough in the red zone. Also not getting to the red zone enough. Has to happen. Don't settle for field goals. You got to get into the red zone. You have to find a way to get 6 instead of settling for 3. That also comes with play calling too. Last week against Washington in the red zone, they decided to run, got stuffed, then they threw a ball tip, picked off in the end zone. I said it last week. You're in the red zone, you're at the 1 yard line. You don't like the running back matchup. Use your 6'6" quarterback to shove that ball into the end zone. Has to. Got to do it. See the Eagles do the tush push. We saw last week Trevor Lawrence on Monday night against the Chiefs running to score touchdowns. Use your 6'6" quarterback. He can get you a yard. The other keys to the game. Defensively, the Chargers need to put pressure on Tua and find a way to limit the run game. Keep A-Chain under 100 yards rushing. Derwin James put pressure on Tua. Derwin also needs to keep an eye out for Darren Waller, who's been a red zone target for Tua. And the other thing this week I want to see defensively is Dian Henley back to week 1 and week 2 form. The past couple weeks, he has not been himself. Like I said, I know he's been sick. I know he lost like 15 pounds from having the flu. But he just hasn't been the same player that he was week 1 and week 2. Last week, he finished almost 3rd to last, I think, in PFF grades, which is just very uncharacteristic of him. So I'd love to see him get back to his week 1 and week 2 form and how well he played last year for the Chargers. I mean, he was lights out last year. But the Chargers this week, they need to do the little things right. Don't commit penalties, get in the right formations, give Herbert a little bit of time to throw, try to get the run game going early, force the Dolphins to throw the ball, keep A-Chain under 100 yards, and you can get a win down in Miami. Now, going into the season, I had the Chargers winning this game down in Miami. I had the Chargers winning a lot of games. I had them going 13-4 this year, which I think if you had a healthy offensive line, that would definitely be the case. But I had the Chargers win this game down in South Florida. I had them winning 31-27. I do not believe that the score will be that high. I just don't. I don't think the Chargers haven't scored over 30 points yet this year. I'm going with a 2017 score down in South Florida. Like I said, the Chargers are getting 4.5. If you factor in home field, it's about 7-8 points. I think it'll be a close game. I'm going to go with 2017. For my own sake, I should pick against the Chargers because I picked them to win twice against the Giants and Washington, and they disappointed me. However, though, I was 2-0 to start. I was 3-0 to start the year. I had them winning against Kansas City. I had them winning against the Raiders, and then I had them winning against Denver. So let's see if I can get back on a win streak with my picks. As I've said, this is a critical game for the Chargers. I think it's a must-win for them to kind of turn momentum, especially heading back home next week to play Indy, who is just firing on all cylinders right now. Get this win, get healthier. You're going to have some players come back next week. And then you're in a good spot to really give it to Indy and see if you can come away with a win. So, with that being said, be sure to subscribe to Electric Edge Podcast on YouTube. You can also listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Follow me on social media at Electric Edge Pod. And Charger fans, let me know in the comments your thoughts for the matchup against Miami. What are you looking most forward to? What do you think the score is going to be? And do you see the Chargers coming away with a win down in South Florida? Let me know in the comments below. Love to read comments from Chargers fans as always. They're always appreciated. And I appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in to listen to me talk Chargers football. But before I let you go, my bolt blast for this week is that I think Kimani Vidal scores a touchdown for the Chargers. I think it is a rushing touchdown he scores for the Chargers this week. So we will see if I'm accurate in my foreshadowing of Sunday's game. So thanks for tuning in. And as always, go Chargers and bolt up.